Your hostas need this in every July, and most gardeners get it completely wrong. If you've got hostas in your garden, you probably think July is a quiet month for them. The spring growth spurt is behind you, the leaves look full and established, and it feels like the hard work is basically done for the season. But July is actually the month that decides whether your hostas make it through August looking lush, or start turning yellow, spotted, and chewed to pieces before you even realize what's happening. And the thing almost every gardener reaches for when their hostas start struggling in the middle of summer: more fertilizer, more water, a stronger pesticide from the garden center, is exactly the wrong move. Today, I'm going to show you what your hostas actually need this month, why the usual advice makes things worse, not better, and how a bottle of 3% hydrogen peroxide sitting in your bathroom cabinet does more for them right now than anything sold in the gardening aisle. Stick with me through the whole routine, because the order you do these things in actually matters more than most gardening advice ever bothers to explain. Let's start with why July specifically is such a dangerous month for hostas, because understanding the problem is the only way the fix actually makes sense. Hostas thrive in the shade. That's exactly why people plant them. They fill in those dim corners of the yard where nothing else wants to grow. But shade also means moisture. The soil under a mature hosta stays damp far longer after watering or rain than soil out in full sun. And by July, with summer humidity climbing and the soil already warmed up from weeks of heat, that combination becomes the perfect breeding ground for fungal problems. Root rot starts quietly, underground, weeks before you ever see a single symptom on the leaves themselves. At the exact same time, July is peak season for slugs and snails, and hostas are basically their favorite meal on the entire property. That leaf damage you might be blaming on just an ugly year or bad luck with the weather is very often a slug problem that's been building for weeks, feeding at night while you're asleep and gone by morning before you ever catch them in the act. So you've got two separate problems, both peaking in the exact same month: fungal issues brewing underground in the moist soil, and slugs shredding the leaves above ground. And most gardeners respond to both of them in exactly the wrong way. Here's the mistake almost everyone makes. When hosta leaves start looking a little rough in July, spotted, yellowing at the edges, maybe a few holes chewed through, the instinct is to water more, assuming the plant is stressed and thirsty. But if root rot is already setting in from excess soil moisture, watering more is like pouring gasoline on a fire you don't even realize is burning yet. The plant looks thirsty because damaged, rotting roots can't actually absorb water properly anymore, even sitting in soil that's already plenty wet. So people water more. The soil gets even soggier, and the rot accelerates. It's a cycle that makes complete sense on the surface, and is almost exactly backwards in practice. The other common mistake is reaching for a chemical fungicide or slug pellet at the first sign of trouble. These products absolutely can work. I'm not going to tell you they don't do anything at all, but they come with real downsides most gardeners don't think through. Chemical fungicides often need repeated applications throughout the month to keep working. They're not a one-and-done fix, and many of them are specifically not recommended for edible gardens or areas where pets and kids play, which rules them out for a lot of backyard setups entirely. Slug pellets, meanwhile, are genuinely dangerous to pets if a dog or cat decides to eat a mouthful of them off the ground. And that happens more often than people expect, especially with curious puppies. There's a third mistake worth mentioning too, one that's a little less obvious. A lot of gardeners see slug damage and yellowing leaves happening at the same time and assume they're looking at one single problem, maybe a disease, maybe a pest they haven't identified yet, and they go searching for one product that claims to handle everything at once. Those does-it-all combination products almost always compromise on both fronts. They're a weaker fungicide diluted with a weaker pesticide, and you end up only half solving either issue. Root rot and slug damage are two completely separate problems that just happen to peak in the same month because of the same underlying summer conditions. And treating them as one problem with one product is part of why so many hostas still look rough by August, even after people genuinely try to fix things. Before we get into the actual fix, it's worth knowing exactly how to tell these two problems apart, because the visible symptoms overlap just enough to confuse people. Slug damage shows up as irregular holes with smooth, rounded edges, usually concentrated on the lower leaves, closest to the ground, where slugs can reach easily. And you'll often see a faint, silvery trail left behind on the leaf surface or nearby soil. That's the slime trail drying in daylight. Root rot, on the other hand, shows up as yellowing that starts at the base of individual leaves and spreads upward, often paired with a mushy, soft feeling at the crown of the plant, if you gently check near the soil line. And the leaves affected by rot tend to droop, even when the soil is clearly still wet, sometimes even wetter than it should be. If you're seeing chewed holes with clean edges, that's slugs. If you're seeing yellowing that starts low and the plant looks thirsty despite damp soil, that's rot. A lot of hostas in July are dealing with both at once, which is exactly why a single-purpose product never quite solves the whole problem. This is where hydrogen peroxide actually earns its place in your July hosta routine, and it solves both problems, the root rot and the slugs, in ways a lot of gardeners have simply never been told about, using two slightly different applications of the exact same cheap bottle. Let's start with the soil and root health side of things, because this is the part that happens underground where you can't see it, and it matters more than anything visible on the leaves. Mix 1 part 3% hydrogen peroxide with 8 parts water. Then water your hostas with this solution instead of plain water, once every couple of weeks throughout July. Here's what's actually happening when you do this. Hydrogen peroxide breaks down into water and oxygen once it hits the soil, and that release of oxygen right at the root zone is exactly what waterlogged, oxygen-starved roots need to recover. Root rot fungi thrive specifically in low-oxygen, soggy conditions. That's their preferred environment. By oxygenating the soil directly, you're making the environment actively hostile to the fungus, while simultaneously giving stressed roots the oxygen they need to start healing and taking up water and nutrients properly again. This is completely different from just cutting back on watering, which is the advice most people give and isn't wrong exactly, but doesn't actually treat existing rot that's already started. It just slows down how much worse things get. The hydrogen peroxide solution treats what's already happening underground, not just what might happen if you keep overwatering. If you're dealing with a hosta that's already showing yellowing leaves and you suspect rot has set in, you can go a step further. Carefully expose a bit of the soil around the base of the plant and pour the diluted hydrogen peroxide solution directly around the root crown, rather than just a general watering across the whole bed. This gets a more concentrated dose of oxygen right where the damaged roots actually are, instead of diluting the effect across soil the plant isn't even using. Now let's talk about the slugs, because this is honestly the part that surprises people the most, since hydrogen peroxide isn't something anyone associates with pest control in the garden. Straight 3% hydrogen peroxide, undiluted this time, sprayed directly onto slugs when you spot them, kills them almost immediately on contact. It works through the exact same oxidation process we've talked about with other pests. It breaks down their soft, mucus-covered bodies in a way they have absolutely no defense against. The best time to catch them is either right at dusk, when they start coming out to feed, or early in the morning before the sun's fully up, since slugs hide in cool, damp spots during the heat of the day, and you'll rarely spot one at noon, no matter how bad your infestation actually is. One thing worth knowing before we go further: not every hosta variety struggles equally in July, and this actually changes how urgently you need to stay on top of this routine. Thin-leafed varieties, the ones with softer, more delicate foliage rather than thick, waxy leaves, are noticeably more prone to both slug damage and rot because their leaf tissue and root structure just doesn't resist moisture and chewing the way a thicker-leafed variety does. If you've got a mix of varieties in the same bed, and you've noticed one specific clump always looks worse by midsummer no matter what you do, it's very likely one of these thinner-leafed types, and it's worth prioritizing that particular plant first if you're short on time and can't get to the whole bed every 2 weeks. For a more passive approach that doesn't require you to go hunting with a spray bottle every evening, soak a cloth or a few cotton balls in hydrogen peroxide and place them at the base of your hostas, especially along the outer edge of the leaf canopy, where slugs typically enter the plant from the surrounding mulch or soil. Slugs actively avoid the area, and you'll notice fresh leaf damage dropping off noticeably within about a week of doing this consistently. Here's a detail almost nobody mentions, and it's the part that really separates this from generic pest advice you'll find anywhere online. Slugs are drawn to decaying organic matter sitting right at soil level. Old mulch, fallen leaves, decomposing plant debris tucked around the base of your hostas. Spraying a diluted hydrogen peroxide mix, 1 part peroxide to 4 parts water, directly onto mulch and leaf litter around your plants, breaks down some of that decaying matter faster and makes the immediate area meaningfully less attractive to slugs looking for both food and shelter in the same spot. You're not just killing the slugs you can see, you're making the whole area less appealing to the ones you haven't spotted yet. Let's bring this all together into an actual routine you can follow, because scattered tips are only useful if you know when and how often to actually use them. Once every 2 weeks through July, water your hostas with the diluted 1 to 8 hydrogen peroxide solution instead of plain water, focusing on the root zone to address any underlying rot and keep the soil oxygenated. In the evenings, especially after a day of rain or heavy watering when slugs are most active, do a quick check with a flashlight and spray any slugs you spot directly with full-strength hydrogen peroxide. And once a week, mist the mulch and leaf litter around the base of your plants with the diluted spray to keep the area less inviting for future slugs looking to move in. This entire routine costs you maybe $3 a month in hydrogen peroxide, compared to fungicide treatments and slug bait that can easily run $20 or $30 over the same period, and need constant reapplication that this method genuinely doesn't require nearly as often. If you're watching this and your hostas are already looking pretty rough, several leaves yellowed, noticeable chew damage, maybe even a section that's collapsed at the base, don't panic and don't assume the whole plant is a loss. Start with the root crown treatment we talked about earlier, exposing the soil slightly and pouring the diluted solution directly around the base, and do it every week instead of every 2 weeks for the first 2 weeks to get ahead of the damage faster. Trim away any leaves that are fully yellowed or mushy at this point, since damaged foliage isn't coming back and just pulls energy away from the parts of the plant that still have a chance to recover. Most established hostas have a strong enough root system to bounce back from a rough July even after visible damage, as long as you address the actual cause instead of just the symptoms on the leaves. One more thing worth mentioning before we wrap up, because it matters for how you apply all of this. Always do your hydrogen peroxide watering either early morning or evening, never in the direct heat of midday sun. Wet leaves combined with strong sunlight can actually cause leaf scorch on hostas, regardless of what you're watering with. That's just true of watering in general during peak sun hours, and it has nothing specifically to do with the peroxide itself. It's simply good practice for any garden watering routine you're running through the hottest part of summer. If you follow this through the rest of July, you should notice healthier, greener growth by early August, fewer chewed leaves, and hostas that are actually building strength for next spring instead of just limping through to the first frost, looking worse every week. It's also worth mentioning that this same 1 to 8 watering solution works just as well on other shade-loving perennials struggling with the same July conditions. Hellebores, astilbe, and bleeding hearts all sit in similarly moist, shaded soil and deal with almost identical root rot risk during peak summer humidity. If your hostas share a bed with any of these, there's no reason to treat one plant and skip the others sitting in the exact same soggy conditions right next to it. And if you're wondering why more people haven't heard about any of this, it's honestly not some big conspiracy. Hydrogen peroxide just isn't something garden centers sell, so there's nobody stocking a shelf with it and telling you it's the answer. Fungicide and slug bait are products with margins built in, something you have to keep buying every season. A bottle of peroxide you probably already own solves a big piece of the same problem, and that's just never going to get the same shelf space or the same advertising push, no matter how well it actually works. It's also worth saying that this isn't a 1 July fix you do once and forget about. Hostas are perennials. They come back every single year, and so does the exact same combination of shade, moisture, and summer heat that creates this problem in the first place. If you make this routine a regular part of your July gardening, right alongside deadheading and regular watering, you'll likely notice each following year gets a little easier than the last, since a hosta that goes into winter with a healthy, unrotted root system comes back stronger and more resistant the next season. It's less about rescuing a struggling plant every summer, and more about building a habit that keeps the problem from ever getting bad enough to notice in the first place. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have your hostas struggled in July before, and did you assume it was just the heat or normal wear and tear from a tough summer? Are you dealing with the rot side of things, the slug side, or honestly, both at once like a lot of people are right now? Drop your answers in the comments. I'd love to hear what's actually going on in your garden this month. If this helped, don't forget to like, share,